Hi and welcome. Creating new projects is fun and exciting, but starting from scratch every single time steals so much momentum right at the start. I solved this for me by creating somewhat of a template project. I'll call it that going forward, but it's not a template as you can find them in the Create New Project dialog window, as much as I'd love to add it there. It's a project I set up with a custom workspace layout, core assets I need in every project, and setting those up in the way I like it. Core changes to some project settings, preferences, and more. So this is not a video on how to automate the setup process, apart from setting up a folder structure. The focus is heavily on setting up a functional workplace, which removes as much friction as possible from those first couple of hours when inspiration strikes. I typically create a template project like this roughly twice a year, and keep working with it until some major new release, or until I notice my workflows and requirements changing, because going through all the settings and thinking about things I want to try differently this time around takes a bit of time. No matter if that is the way you want to approach it or not, I am convinced you will learn something new here, which will help you going forward. And just a general tip at the start, depending on your screen size, Unity elements can look a little bit small and hard to navigate. You can change the UI scaling of the editor if you are on Windows under Preferences, UI Scaling. I typically have mine set to about 125%. Okay, giving it a fresh start. The first thing I do is typically to remove this URP info window, then heading straight to my assets. None of the assets I show here are absolutely critical to follow along with the rest of the video, but maybe you'll see something you could use for your own setup. The first asset I import is always Odin Inspector, followed by all the other assets shown here. I recently made a video about my favorites, but you can find a link to all of these in the first comment. And as much as I love to automate things, I actually enjoy to not do so with this download process, even though it takes quite a bit of time. As mentioned, I do this twice a year, and this is pretty much a fun evening for me, not a chore. I like going through my ever-growing list of assets, reminding myself of which I have, which I might have forgotten about, and which I had planned to use on the next template, or maybe in a future project. I enjoy seeing which assets got updates too. Never optimize the fun out of projects just for the sake of optimization and speed. But if you want to learn how to automate it, I think Gitamat's video on the topic might be up your alley. Watch that after this one maybe. So once everything has been downloaded, I tackle the folders. All my projects come with a typical base folder structure. However, instead of creating that inside the project manually, or hard-coding a structure into a folder construction script, I keep a text file in my notes, where I add or remove folders I found myself needing across projects. The structure is, I hope, self-explanatory, but if you'd like to copy it, make sure you are using 4 indents instead of a tab to build the tree structure. Let's have a look at the automation for this. I create a first editor folder and get to work. Here's the first reason why I feel like Odin is such a valuable asset in every project. Creating editor windows is as simple as creating monobehaviors with it. It inherits from Odin editor window and needs an open window method, but the rest looks and works just like any other script without having to add labels and fields manually. This structure builder tool takes a text asset and by clicking a button, will create the folder structure found within. It splits all the lines found inside the text field and prepares an array of paths so it can sort subfolders correctly. To understand the structure, it counts the white spaces and picks out the corresponding parent folder. From there, it just checks if the folder exists, and if it doesn't, creates it. The tool sits inside the Tools dropdown. And once you hand it the text file and click the button, your folder structure will be created. Keep in mind that this tool does no sanity checks. You could mess up the indentation or use characters not supported in your file system quite easily. But I know how to write folder names, so I haven't run into any kind of issue with this. After the structure is set up, you can move all those asset folders cluttering your root into the plugins folder. Here's where We folders comes into play, because this is typically where I assign the colors to folders by alt-clicking on them. Limiting yourself in colors as well as which folders to highlight pays off here. Over the last few years, I grew accustomed to marking the editor and scripts folders with red, while UI-related things are getting colored in blue or bluish-green. The rest of the folders typically stay uncolored at this stage, because every project has its own structures and systems I need to track. Onwards to a first round of asset setup. You can see that the name of long files is being partly cut off if you are looking at large icon grids in the project view. I go to Tools, vFolders, and enable two-line names to make it better readable again. I also enable the navigation bar. This gives me forward-backwards arrows, but more importantly, I can add quick links to specific folders I know I have to browse through the most often. Enabling or disabling background colors changes the way the highlights look, and since I'm typically using background colors to highlight elements in the hierarchy, I use it here as well. The layout of the editor comes next, because the default one is a good compromise between lots of use cases, but a compromise means it could be a lot better in some specific cases. Here's where we are having a look at workspaces, which are predefined setups for how the editor windows are organized. If you've never paid attention to the dropdown, make sure to click on each entry and see what it looks like. You might find something you like there. I will, however, delete all but the default one. My typical setup when I'm working with UI or symbolish scenes has the game on the top left, the scene view beside it, and because I want the distance my mouse travels to be as short as possible, the hierarchy sits directly next to the inspector. This is also why I love the vHierarchy asset, because it gives me toggles right next to the game objects to quickly set them to active or to inactive. The right part of the editor is the inspector, and thanks to vtabs, I can pin a quick link to the Text Mesh Pro text styles object here as well. I use that a lot, and if you have seen my text style videos, you'll know why. I'll get back to this further to the end of this project setup, as text styles are a part of this process. In the second row, I'll have the project view and smart library, Editor Console Pro, and most times some project-specific helper. In my pixel art app, that space is taken up by a quick system to open and close specific windows, for example, which is another tool I use Odin for. Once everything is sitting where I expect it to be, the layout can be saved by clicking up here again. You can enter the name of an existing layout, and you will be prompted with a check if you want to override it, which is handy when you notice your workspace hadn't been working for you as expected and you want to make some changes. There are 3.5 more workspace layouts I use a lot. The first is simply called sorting and looks like this. I use this when working with larger asset packs, like with the Cinti ones, or when I generally find myself with lots and lots of graphical assets I want to use. This is where Asset Library earns a spotlight. I can create folders in here, smart or otherwise, and drag and drop elements from all across my project into it. The files stay where they are, but by using Asset Library, I can sort each entry into multiple places, which is ultra handy when world building. The preview images can also be a lot larger than the default ones from Unity, which is a major plus, especially for more complex assets. In this view, I go through the project on the left, have Asset Library right beside it, because most times the small previews Unity displays are enough to sort assets correctly, followed by a scene view. If I'm not sure what kind of asset I have my mouse over, I open it up and typically have an idea in which folder to sort it right then. And while there is an inspector, it has to share its space with some tools I built to make it simpler to create alternatives of models, for example by iterating through all alternative textures and creating prefab variants that way. Sorting asset packs can take up quite some time, so creating a dedicated workspace just for this task alone seemed like a great use case. But next is world building. In this one, I have the game view hidden behind the scene view, have no console whatsoever in the bottom bar, and instead of the project, I display the asset library instead. Basically, if it doesn't exist in the library at this point, it won't exist in my world, which is why I'd like to take some time in the previous workspace before jumping into this one. And here's also where the half workspace comes in. I use the full screen asset a lot. F10 lets me full screen the game view, which makes any project feel instantly more real. Stupid that might sound. But F11 expands the scene view. This lets me focus on placing elements inside the scene much better. Knowing the shortcuts for rotation, scale, and move pays off here. The third workplace is for visual effects and shadograph. And I guess it could work well for animations too, but I'm not yet at a state where I can say I found the perfect workspace layout for that yet. Again, the game view is hidden behind the scene view. My project window is sitting below the inspector this time, as I hardly need to move across the project at this stage. The hierarchy is stored away as well. I usually have a sandbox scene I use while working on shaders or VFX, so it's rare there's a whole lot to keep track of inside of them anyway. Alright, back to the default workspace for now, and I'd love to hear your opinion here. What kinds of layouts have you been using? Or did you get an idea for one? Please let me know. Next up, I'll configure the initial scene. It gets a new name, and I typically create a few game objects I know I need, together with an initial canvas. Tubby Context has been a fun recent addition to my toolbox, and I enjoy the way it changes the look of the right-click menu a lot. However, I set its scaling to be slightly smaller, so that I can still keep all important infos visible at a glance. This is also already the place where I will set a default parent object for whatever I'm going to drop into the scene at a later point, because there have been entirely too many projects at this point with absolutely chaotic hierarchies, because I threw stuff just everywhere. With vHierarchy 2, I color typical things I need to keep an eye on, like certain managers, the camera and audio system, or any kind of canvas. If you like these darker areas and have the assets, just create a new game object, change its name to a single empty space, and set the background color to anthracite by alt-clicking on it. If you don't want to use any of the predefined icons, you can just add new ones by clicking on the plus sign. This one is particularly invisible on a dark background, for example. Just like with colors, certain objects tend to have the same kinds of icons across projects for me, to make finding them, even in cluttered hierarchies, a lot simpler. I also create an empty scene for the main menu at this point and drop that into the scene list, so I don't forget about it. That happened so often. This being done, I can start setting up presets. Presets are great. They are basically quick assign settings for any component you have. For example, I really don't like the way the default UI graphics look, so I start by importing a basic 1 pixel sized graphic to use as my base. And before I can set it up, we run into the first use case for a preset. By default, and I will never understand why, graphics are being imported as default, and even when switched over to being a sprite for 2D and UI, it defaults to multiple. Don't know about you, but neither of these settings reflects my use case. Luckily, it's an easy fix. Change the settings to how you need them once and apply your changes. In the top right corner is an icon looking like sliders. That's the preset overview, basically. It opens an empty list, and by double-clicking the magnifying glass, you are being asked where to save the preset. If you are going along with this and took my structure, you'll find a settings folder at the root of the project. For simplicity's sake, keep the assigned name and click Save. Now head over to Edit, Project Settings, and find the entry for Preset Manager inside. Once you get started with this, you might find more and more things to add to it. It handles the default way systems and components are set up when they are created. To change the way images are being imported, we need the Texture Importer preset. As you can see, there are also others that might be important to the way you work with Unity, like audio or FBX importers. Leave the search box empty and just add your preset to the designated field. From now on, everything you import will use these settings. Well, at least graphics. Well, my 1 pixel graphic for the default image component needs a few other settings to work as I want it to, as you can see when I drop it into an image component. I'll use these settings for this one graphic only, as it's a bit of a special case. I turn it into a preset, go back to the manager, and this time choose Component from the dropdown. Then navigate to UI and pick Image, or simply type image into the search bar. Now, all my future images will have a default image assigned to them. And why a 1 by 1 pixel graphic? It's super tiny with just about 12 bytes, and it's a great starting point for most basic UI work. The pixel stretches perfectly in every direction and can be colored without problems. And hey, if you learned something new and enjoyed this walkthrough so far, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe. If you're missing anything or have questions, drop them into the comments. We stay in the realm of UI, and we urgently need to talk about Text Mesh Pro. I hate Liberation Sans with all of my heart. It's just such an ugly choice. So of course, my projects use a different default font until I figure out what the end project will look like. Noto Sans is perfectly suitable, very readable, comes in a plethora of weights, and an open font license, which means it can be used in personal and commercial projects alike. Which is awesome. You can find it on fonts.google.com, and when unzipping it, you'll see that it comes with condensed and ultra-condensed styles. Those are great for when you really need to cram a lot of information in just not enough space. Street signs are a great example for this, but I haven't run into any use cases in my projects yet, luckily. Importing the basics from thin to black is all I need. With Shift-Control F12, all selected fonts are turned into TMP font assets, and for the next step, we need to move those into the TMP resources folder for fonts, or run the risk of hiccups down the line. Select the regular weight and scroll down a bit. Here's where you will find the table of font styles. Text Mesh Pro offers you buttons to italicize or bolden the text inside the text box, but if you don't set up the corresponding fonts, it will just hallucinate what those weights might look like, and that always looks incredibly hideous. And B, by setting them up in here, you gain access to using all of them inside text styles, not just the italic or bold ones. You really should give those a look, and you will in a moment. Luckily, we really only need to set this up for the baseline font of the project, so in my case, that will be the regular weight. Depending on your project, preferences, and font, it could also be bold or medium. In that case, hook these weights up to those files instead. Your font doesn't have to offer all those weights, of course. Hardly any project uses them all. But I like to know I have everything available right here. Once you settle on the font of your game, you'll have to set it up like this too, so going through this once is good practice. Let's create an initial text box and fill it with some short description. I defaulted to just button label and size it in a way that looks readable. I always found the 35-point text mesh uses by default to be way too big and way too clunky. Make sure to set your game's aspect ratio to something real like 1920 by 1080 to be able to judge appropriately. If you don't have full screen editor, you can expand the view by hitting Shift and Spacebar to see the actual proportions of things in your scene. But since I have the assets, I'll use it and expand with F10 instead. 24p is a good starting point in my opinion. If you don't see this info window at the bottom of your inspector, you can open it by dragging it up or clicking on it. This window will tell you the layout properties of your selected elements, and in our case, we want to check for preferred height and preferred width. Those are the ideal sizes for this specific text box. Mark those down, or just leave the text box selected in the hierarchy, then go to Edit, Project Settings, Text Mesh Pro, Settings. Here we can define how our TMP components look out of the box. The default text asset will be Noto Sans Regular, and here you can see the path where the TMP font asset needs to be stored for TMP to find them. You can set up a lot more, but these are my typical spotlights. Under Text Container Default Settings, set Text Mesh Pro UI to the values you saw in the Layout component info box. Rounding up is typically what I do. I also always disable Raycast Target. There are use cases for it, like hovering over words or clicking on them to get further infos or jump to other locations in a dialogue. More on that on the linked videos. But those are outliers, not baseline. Typically, I don't want texts to block any kind of raycast. You can set the default font size here as well. And as tempting as it might be to click Auto Size Text Container, please don't. You really don't want that by default, and it's simple to set up where it will be actually needed at a later point. These settings are purely for the default text box after all. You can set up a default sprite asset here too, which can come in handy if you want a specific baseline sprite set for the project, for example for icons or sprites to use in text boxes. but I typically keep it as is, since the sprites I actually need will always depend on the project anyway. That concludes the TextMesh Pro setup here, so let's head over to the default style sheet we see linked in this field. If you ever worked with CSS, you should be able to read text styles without any kind of issue. It's basically the layout sheet for font use in your project, and the great thing is that any changes you make here get instantly updated in all places across it. I have by now created a baseline version I take from project to project, but let's start with a clean slate here and delete the default one to create a new. And remember to drag it into the field for it in the settings. You will always have a normal style, which gets applied by default, but I found that I also always need a centered label for buttons, one for simple menu labels and one for headlines. For buttons, the text should always be centered. Let's switch the text box over from normal to using a button label style for this. We can align the text by using rich font tags with this one. There is no tag for vertical alignment, and no, VSpace doesn't work like that. Since, and I have to guess here, you can use multiple styles inside the text box by using the style tag, and having two paragraphs fighting over vertical space might get messy. I like my headlines to be bold, use one of the many different font weights Noto Sans offers, and to be about 1.4 em the size of the baseline we defined prior. If your text box text is set up to 24 points, this would mean a headline is 33.6 points, without us having to change any numbers in the component, for example. Experiment a little, find out what you'd like to use. You can find lots of rich text tags like these over in the link documentation, but I also made a handy cheat sheet that visualizes which tags fit which setting. You can find it in my Ko-fi store for free. The link is in the comments. The last one I need is for labels. These really depend on my project, so I typically have them use an italic style to stand out. I go into much more detail on text styles in one of my earliest videos. The contents are still as up-to-date as they were back then, so maybe give those a watch. If you know you regularly need specific use cases for your text boxes, like dialogue texts or special emphasis that goes beyond bold and italic, I highly recommend adding them here. It's one of the best features of TextMesh Pro I've ever come across. Alright, most is done at this point. To get started with new projects quickly, I created a core color palette I'll drag from project to project. It's just a simple list of colors for backgrounds, foregrounds, and specific use cases, and it's incredibly helpful to work with when prototyping. You can find lots of great color palettes out there, some focusing on UI design, some on general palettes, some on games. My pick here is actually low spec, as they have a great variety of palettes and each comes with a preview image on how the colors work in a project. Start looking for a nice one with about 8 colors. More will quickly lead to analysis paralysis, less won't have the needed variancy you need to cluster and structure hierarchical infos and backgrounds. Sort by download and look for one with a mix of darks, lights, and accents. Your future projects will most likely look very, very different from these, but having working and harmonic looking colors right from the start typically lessens the mental load of feeling like you need to do things right out of the gate. Create a new palette and the color picker. Storing it in the default location is typically fine. Click on List View, then sample each color and click on the square down here to add it to the palette. You will be able to add names for the colors here too. I typically only label critical ones with terms like main accent, secondary accent, background, interactable, and card. You can order and sort these swatches too, of course, replace and delete them. Alright, some finishing touches. Let's head back to the project settings and look at the root namespace entry in the editor. Add your own. For me, that's typically either Christina or Christina Creates Games, if I'm doing anything channel related. If you have trouble finding the settings, you can enter the name up here and you will be jumped to it. Inside the player settings, change the company name to something besides default company. You can change that later at any point, but I see so many games I've played over the years still using default company that I just had to include this. If you open up Splash Image, you could disable the splash screen, sure. But I urge you to watch my video on how to create a cool splash screen instead. You can do really nice things with this It really doesn't have to be the standard and horrifically ugly brownish gray background with the Unity logo. Please, I just don't want to see that again. From here, all that's left is adding a git ignore to the project to make sure GitHub won't get cluttered, and adding systems you created previously, which you want to keep sticking around. My rule here is simple. If the systems are specific, like an inventory or quest system, I'll keep them out of the template. If they are more general, like utilities, helpers, or mostly all of my UI scripts and systems, they go in. And lastly, remove all stray assets from your scene, switch to the workspace layout you want to be greeted with every time, and save your project. From here, whenever I want to create a new project, I instead duplicate this project's folder, rename it, and get started. And yes, this takes a bit of time every time. I would very much love if Unity could just create a button like Create from Template, where we can define what that template is, but alas. I really hope you enjoyed this and found a few things to give a try. Anything in particular you were surprised about? Let me know in the comments or over on my Discord. And again, a like is very much appreciated. I typically create UI Center tutorials, so if you're looking for those, consider subscribing too. Have a great week!